Radio Free Campus, brought to you by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni.
Welcome to Radio Free Campus. I'm Steve McGuire.
And I'm Justin Garrison, and in this episode, Steve and I talk with Professor Lee Strang, the Executive Director of the Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at The Ohio State University, about the early days of the Chase Center itself and the state of civic education in Ohio and the United States more broadly. So, Steve, let's get to it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to Lee today and, talk a little bit more about the Chase Center in particular, but also these civic centers that have been popping up all over the country, and how they're trying to address what is a real lack of civic education in American higher ed, as well as, bring some intellectual diversity to their campuses and to the sector in general. And I think, Lee's going to be a great person to talk to about this. He's got a distinguished career as a legal scholar. He was previously a director of another center at the University of Toledo, and now for the last couple of years, he's been leading this effort at Ohio's flagship university, OSU. So let's get to the conversation. Lee, welcome to Radio Free Campus.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve and Justin.
Yeah, we're so glad you could join us. So you're the director of the Chase Center at Ohio State University, and as most of our listeners, I think, will know, there's a movement creating civic centers at universities all around the country, and recently 5 centers were created at universities in Ohio, of which the Chase Center is one. And I think for most of these centers, the main part of their mission is to enhance civic education at the universities. And another thing that they want to do is bring some extra ideological diversity to the faculty, the course offerings, et cetera, at the universities. So I just wanted to open up. We'll talk about the civic mission, I think, in a minute. But first, maybe just tell us a little bit about how the Chase Center got started, what its mission is, and then address the question of intellectual diversity and how that's part of the Chase Center's mission.
Yeah, and thanks for a very pithy introduction to what the Chase Center does. And so, as you said, Steve, Ohio has the honor of being the state with the most of the schools of civic thought in any one particular state. And they were created by the state of Ohio in 2023. And I think from the perspective of the General Assembly and the governor, what they saw were kind of 2 related challenges that they were hoping that the schools of civic thought in Ohio would respond to. So one, you mentioned implicitly in your description of our mission, is a relative lack of knowledge about the common things that we Americans hold together. It could be, I'm the lawyer, so it could be some common legal documents like the Constitution or Declaration. For folks who are fans of literature, it could be the great American literature that we have, and maybe even before that, Western literature. So there's just a lack of knowledge of the things the good things, the many and genuine good things that Americans hold in common. And then related to that, I think partly, this is my own view, partly as a consequence of the failure to see the things that we share in common as Americans, is the relative decline in civility among Americans, and not just in the political realm, but kind of in many or most spheres of American life. And so the schools of civic thought were meant to address both of those challenges. So the mission of the Chase Center, which is similar or identical to the mission of the other 5 schools of civic thought, has a number of components, but you said exactly right, Steve. The main mission that we have is to do teaching and researching of the great books, the debates, and the texts of the American civic tradition. And so that includes stuff from America. It also includes stuff that came before the United States. There's the tippage of, Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome would be a part of that, and the kind of the heritage that we get from that. And you're also right, Steve, that one part of the mission of the Chase Center and other schools of civic thought is to enhance the intellectual diversity of the universities. And so how does that play a role, or how does that come to be related to the transmission of the American civic tradition? And one of the things that I've had, as you might not be surprised, in my 2 years of leadership at the Chase Center, many, many conversations with people of all different backgrounds, intentionally so, in perspectives, is I'll share with them the mission that we just talked about. And 201, I've never had, and this is hundreds and hundreds of conversations, I've never had anybody who said that mission is an unsound mission, that people, I think, see, regardless of your perspective, left, right, and center, that Americans are losing access to this common civic tradition, and we are really at each other's throats in many ways. And so people of all different backgrounds embrace the mission. I have seen, I think it's fair to say, people who are skeptical that the mission would be implemented in a way that Americans of all backgrounds could see as a fair implementation of the mission. So we've worked really hard to do that, and that correlates with this commitment to enhancing our university's intellectual diversity. And that, in my view, comes in many different packages. There are many different mechanisms of doing that. One thing which it is not, which goes to my previous point, is picking people with R's or D's or L's or whatever after their names. Like there's no questions, there's no research. What we're looking for is people, and this is literally what we ask people at multiple steps when it's faculty or staff in joining the Chase Center is, here's the Chase Center's mission of citizenship education. Please help us understand how you see that. And please help us understand how, if you were to join our community, that you would enhance our mission of citizenship education. That's the kind of intellectual diversity that we look for. And the way that has cashed out, Steve, is in many areas. So one is the courses, right? So one of the courses that we're offering this upcoming academic year, I'm really excited about, is precisely one of those aspects of the American civic tradition that many Americans don't have access to in their educational opportunities. And it's the great American novel. So our English scholar, Michael Clune, is going to present, based on his judgment, what are the most the best American novels, and introduce students to doing that. And you might say, well, why would we be doing that? Isn't that being done already? And the answer, this is apropos of why we needed the Chase Center, is that it isn't being done beforehand, that there is no class for 46,000 undergraduate students on the great American novel. And so we're going to offer that, and it's going to enhance our students' education. So courses is one area where we're enriching the intellectual diversity of the university. Another is public programming. So the way I think about the Chase Center's contribution to public programming is each university is its own academic community, and there are conversations ongoing all the time. And some of them are connected with what's going on in the outside world, but some of them are connected with what's going on internal to the university. And we try to identify where are some gaps in the conversation that maybe because of a relative lack of intellectual diversity, that the members of the community aren't seeing as important topics of conversation. And I'll give you one that we're just really excited about. It's going to be our signature debate this upcoming academic year. It's going to be a debate on the role of expertise in American democracy. And the catalyst for that is kind of twofold. So one is, and I genuinely believe this, that universities and faculty have expertise, that as a lawyer I have got expertise, and my historian colleagues have expertise, and my colleagues in public policy and health have expertise. But at the same time, we live in a republic where at least a large chunk of Americans, with some justification, view expertise as having been overextended, overutilized. And COVID was maybe the most prominent example of that. So we're hosting a debate between two people, one who thinks that expertise has been over-leveraged, and one who thinks that expertise has not been leveraged sufficiently. And that's actually one of the problems with America, is that we don't have enough expertise being listened to. And that's a conversation that hasn't occurred, but it seems like, given the COVID experience that Americans had gone through, OSU, a major research university, is precisely the place where that kind of conversation should occur. Another area where we're expanding the intellectual diversity of our university community is in the faculty. And as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any litmus test other than you need to be a fan and enhance the Chase Center's mission. But what we found, Steve, and you this is probably not surprising to you and Justin, is that if you have an academic unit that is explicitly nonpartisan, that is explicitly saying, here's a mission that unites people of all different backgrounds, religions, creeds, etc., and what you find is that Americans of all different backgrounds want to be part of that community. And so what we found is that our academic community is one that's rich in intellectual diversity of all the different kinds that you might think. And it's made our conversation so rich internally. I'll just give you one example. So we have a workshop series where all of our faculty, when they're working on different papers, articles, book chapters, whatever, present. And it's been so great. It's been a learning experience for me because my background's in the legal academy. It's been so great seeing our scholars from different disciplinary backgrounds and having other commitments sharing their comments in a civil and robust way to enhance our colleagues' scholarship. And the last thing I would just piggyback on this idea of scholarship. One of our faculty members, Jesse Smith, who's a sociologist, has written a lot and published a lot about how does intellectual diversity among the faculty and the scholarly community enhance the product of scholarship itself. And his argument, which is, I think, a very powerful argument, is that you need to have scholars in whatever disciplinary community we're talking about who come from different backgrounds, because then they'll be able to challenge, again, in a civil way, but robust way, challenge the arguments of the authors of different papers. And so Jesse and his scholarship is both in his scholarship and then in what he does as a teacher and a scholar inside the Chase Center is an example about how we've enriched the intellectual diversity in the scholarly world. So long answer, trying to tie together all the different aspects of our mission.
Well, thanks. No, that's a fantastic answer. It's really interesting to hear all the different ways that you're thinking about this and approaching it. I think, a lot of the time when people hear intellectual diversity or viewpoint diversity, they go straight to, how many Republicans are on the faculty or something like that. And fair enough, because, and I'm guilty of this myself, that's often the quickest, easiest way to highlight that maybe there are some issues. And a lot of the, sort of quick ways to point this out in terms of data is like surveys of faculty and that sort of thing, in terms of their political or ideological viewpoints. But I think what you're talking about highlights how we're talking about topics that are being covered, questions that are being asked, methodological approaches, all these sorts of things, and that you're bringing things to the university that weren't there or weren't robust enough. And so it seems like a really positive contribution. But let me get Justin in here to ask the next question.
Thank you so much for your response to that. That was very thoroughly and really illuminating. I was thinking about preparing for this conversation, and there's that old Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams, right? If you build it, they will come.
Yes.
And you've given us a great account of all of the great building that you've been doing in the short time that the Chase Center's been around. Are the students showing up? Is my question. Are they enrolling in the classes? Are they coming to these extracurricular events? And how do you see that response reflecting kind of more broadly on why the Chase Center was needed in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually grew up in the neighboring small town to where Field of Dreams was filmed in Iowa. And so when I took the job, actually, that metaphor came to my mind. If you build it, and I took it slightly differently. Will they come, right? Or like create it in such a way that it will be an attractive offering or opportunity that students will want to come. So just to give you a couple of kind of data points and then nest them within the broader structure of the Chase Center. So we had our first classes in the fall of 25. We had 2 classes. It's been, just as an aside, you might say, well, gosh, the Chase Center has been around for, by that point, over a year. But you have to have the faculty. You have to have the curriculum process, which is very lethargic is the way I'll describe it. And we're able to get 2 classes. And we started off with approximately 40 students in the fall of 25. We had, I think, 7 sections or 7 classes in the spring of 26, and we had about 140 students at that point. Our plan is to have 400 students this fall and some large number more than that in the spring of 27. So we're having continued robust growth. And I'll just share, and for our listeners, they can go to our website. We have some kind of student anecdotes that capture their students' experiences. And of course, these are curated, but I see our student evaluations. The students are really enjoying the conversations they're having in class. And I'll just share with you one anecdote from a student. In fact, it was at one of our community building activities is we have weekly coffees, and one of our students was there, and I just was asking, hey, how's your class experience going? And the student, who is a leader in student government and had been, by his own account, he shared this with me in the conversation, had been a public critic of the Chase Center, but to his credit, took one of our classes and wanted to see, hey, are they back to our earlier conversation? Are they actually doing what they're saying that they were doing in a way that Americans of all viewpoints could respect and embrace? And he said he had a wonderful class. It was a class that dealt with some of the debates we've had, past, present, about America, what it is, what are our commitments, are we living up to them, those kind of conversations. And the student had shared, one of the things that was a challenge to him was, it was the first class that student had where the student had to read entire texts, like entire books, and was thankful for, right? It was not something that he necessarily enjoyed initially, but like many good things, right, we come to appreciate it with hindsight. And so the student was moved from being a public critic of the Chase Center to being a public proponent of the Chase Center, and now helps the Chase Center attract other students. We have something called the Chase Society. The Chase Society is our formal community. It's our formal invitation to students to become part of the academic and intellectual community of the Chase Center. We have lots of events that occur throughout the year. One of the events was a person who was a Marxist who came to advocate for Marxism, and he was kind of lamenting from his perspective the demise of Marxism in the U.S. And so it was a really robust conversation, a lot of fun. We had a person come and speak about jazz in the American civic tradition. We've had people talk about architecture. So all the things that are part of America, right? That are fun and provocative. We have movie nights, and we have over 300 students who are members of the Chase Society. One really important aspect of that, Justin, has been we had our first study abroad opportunity this last spring. We took 20 students to Oxford, England, to Oxford University. We have partnerships there where the students did tutorials, Oxford style. We call it Oxford in Ohio, and the students got to see a beautiful medieval academic city, London, Bath. And the thing that struck the students most, and this was all of them said this because we always afterwards ask for feedback, of course, and all the students said that the thing that was most valuable to them was we had partnered with an organization called Think, Think, that hosts a really interesting way of doing conversation. So there was a dinner at one of the kind of Harry Potter-esque tables, right? And there was a speaker on a controversial subject, and the speaker set up the topic, this controversial subject, and then through a survey, we set groups of 4 to 5 people, including our students, including Oxford people as well, around different tables who would then have conversations with some ground rules, right? Like no name calling, of course. And many students shared with us personally and then through our feedback mechanism about how impactful that was. And one of our students who participated in the event was a young woman. She had shared that her perspective was a left-of-center perspective. It wasn't something, of course, that we asked, but something that she had volunteered. And she had said 2 things. One was that she had never had a conversation on that topic with somebody of a different viewpoint, which I have to say, honestly, I was a little bit sad to hear that because this person, is a college student, and this is an important issue that Americans debate and discuss. But second, she said that the conversation that she had did a couple of things that helped her understand the perspective of people who have a different view than her, and it humanized. It made, in other words, she came out of that conversation equipped to have more conversations like that in a really civil way as she goes out her life as an American citizen. So we've got classes where the growth is growing, Justin. We've got our student program where it's growing, and then our public programming is like another way to kind of test and see the impact that we're having. And we had about 10 large public events over our past academic year. The average attendance was somewhere north of 100. The highest attendance was around 250. And those include, as I said, conversations that aren't happening otherwise. So one of my favorite events was we had Dr. Danielle Allen, who's at Harvard and is a proponent of citizenship education. She's somebody who is visibly of a different perspective than, let's say, most people associate with the civic thought movement, which was one reason why her conversation was really valuable to our OSU community. And she had shared, which was her remarks were on the basis of an article she had written in The Atlantic called A New Social Compact for Higher Education. And for our listeners who may not have read it, the article basically says that post-World War II, there was a compact between American society, and higher ed, and that compact has frayed in a number of ways and for a number of reasons. One of them, you had referred to earlier, Steve, was the perception and the reality of a relative monoculture developing over time in higher ed, which about half of Americans think doesn't include them. But then her solution that she shared with the OSU community was to focus on citizenship education in a way that all Americans can get behind. And that itself was wonderful, right? That we had 250 OSU and other community members attending that conversation. But one of the things I really remember was afterwards, a faculty member from OSU came and said, when the Chase Center was established, I was really skeptical of you guys. I thought that you were just going to be doing kind of Republican rah kind of stuff, and this and other activities that you've engaged in has persuaded me. And and this is a quote. She said, "Now I'm a fan." And so there's been a lot of positive impact because I think people had reasons to be skeptical, and now as they see us being implemented in a fair way, they're able to say, "Yeah, this is actually enriching OSU." So I think lots of growth. We're not anywhere near kind of the end of our growth trajectory, Justin. We're basically have one solid year under our belt, and I think it's going to be another 3 years before we get to a kind of not no more growth, but kind of a level of stability. We're going to launch our first major in July 1st here. It's Civics, Law, and Leadership. It's our citizenship degree, and we have 3 other majors planned over the next 2.5 years. A Civics honors major, a major for classical education teaching, and then a great books and ideas major as well. And so as those ramp up, then we'll have more opportunities for students to take courses and to major in our courses. So it's been good.
Yeah, that's really great.
No, I think that's wonderful because people can say the right things in public, but students are very perceptive about what's actually happening in the classroom. And it's one of the reasons they might be drawn to your center. They know what's really going on in their own classes, their other classes outside of the center. I think that's so wonderful. Having been a professor previously, I know that word of mouth from students, good and bad, carries a tremendous amount of weight in a way that faculty members and administrators really can't compete with. So if you're getting people, at the student level coming in saying, I was skeptical, but this is wonderful and I'm glad to be a part of it, that's a tremendous measure of success in my view. I'm really delighted to hear that.
Yeah, and it's a credit to our faculty who are, they're committed to just pursuing truth. They're committed to pursuing truth in community and in community with students, and they really treat our students as co-travelers or fellow travelers in this pursuit of truth. So they're inviting them into the conversation, and you're exactly right, Justin. What we want is we want our brand to be one where this is a place where you're going to encounter ideas and thoughts that you haven't encountered before in a way that's challenging in a very positive way, but also enriching and affirming. And so I think we're on the right track for that.
That's brilliant. Steve.
Lee, just real quick, I was wondering, how many faculty do you have on staff, and are you continuing to hire? There may be people listening who would be interested to know.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. And so stepping back, right, our mission is to share with OSU students, with Americans more generally, and we haven't even talked about our K through 12 outreach, supporting K through 12 teachers in Ohio and around the country about the American civic tradition, which includes lots of different disciplinary perspectives, so law and history, political science, theology. And we are up to, when you add all of our different faculty of different types, we're at approximately 25 faculty will be here this next academic year. And we still have some growth, partly because for example, we have one person who teaches literature, but primarily American literature. We need somebody who will teach Western literature. We have some folks who have some aspects of leadership, but we need somebody who is an expert in leadership. Another area of growth for us is natural law and natural rights. It's an important part of the American civic tradition. There aren't many scholars out there, I think actually for reasons of the sociology of higher ed, like you just can't get a job doing that. And so we need some folks in that area as well. So we're looking for targeted areas that fill in some gaps and opportunities that we have.
That's great. I mean, that speaks right there to, again, how you contribute to intellectual diversity, in terms of like, if there's a field that's so critical to the American tradition where people worry that they couldn't even get a job if they studied it, and now somebody can, hopefully.
Yeah.
I also, what you said about the student who had never debated these topics, we see that so often. I mean, Justin and I are constantly looking at the data about shout downs and intolerance and self-censorship on campus. And, these are real problems. And there is a significant percentage of students across the nation who say that they think it's okay to shout down speakers, or, sometimes even called for. And of course, we see these incidents, on a semi-regular basis. And so there are real concerns. But on the other hand, at ACTA, we have our campus debates and discourse program, which, travels around the country working with students and faculty, putting on these, debates where people come together and share their views on controversial topics. And the universal response pretty much is that people just find it so enriching. It's a completely positive experience. They hear things that they haven't heard before. Like you mentioned, it humanizes people, or it humanizes the arguments. They see like, oh, this isn't like some terrible bogeyman who thinks this. It's a person who's otherwise totally normal like me. We just really disagree. And so I think that's a really interesting dynamic among students, where we see on the one hand that there is a certain segment who are going to endorse or even engage in certain kinds of intolerant behaviors, don't want to engage in conversation. But I do think that there is a large chunk who, when they're given the opportunity to do this kind of thing, really respond positively. And it seems like you're already seeing that at the Chase Center, both in terms of your classroom work and your on-campus work, but also your broader contributions to the community.
I think that's right, Steve. And I think your read of the student body is right. My perception, which is just really honestly anecdotal, is that more and more students want to be able to have conversations that they're interested in. And so I think there might be a shift more in the category of people who are attracted to the kind of debates and conversations that you all at ACTA are hosting and offering and forming, and same here at the Chase Center. And I also want to say that I think, most faculty, by their own lights, want to facilitate that as well. Mm-hmm. And OSU, one of the areas where it's been good, even before the Chase Center came, has been in its official commitment and its implementation of trying to provide spaces for debating and conversation. We have a partner, the Center for Ethics and Human Values, which one of the things that it has done is sponsored debates and conversations and really help train people about how, if you're a young person who grew up in America, just around people who had the same views as you, maybe you're curated because of social media, because of the zip code you live in, et cetera. It's not natural for that person in the kind of Aristotelian sense. It's not natural to be able to want to and be able to do it well, engage with people of different viewpoints. And so CHV has been a mechanism inside of OSU to help provide people with the skills of that. And we are good partners with them to try to do something similar.
That's fantastic. Well, Justin, you want to jump in again?
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone we're talking with Professor Lee Strang, the Executive Director of the Chase Center for Civics, Culture, and Society at The Ohio State University. And, we've been hearing a lot of great things about what you're doing at the Chase Center and the really positive response from faculty and from students. I was wondering if you could take a kind of a step back and we could get more of a macro view, of your perception of why is something like the Chase Center even needed? What is the purpose of civic education? Why is that something that higher ed ought to be doing instead of, kind of abandoning it or just neglecting it as it seems to have been the case previously? And then, how has Ohio more broadly, Steve talked about this and, you know it quite well that, the Chase Center is one among several other centers in Ohio. Why is Ohio doing this? What should the rest of the country take away from this concerted effort in your state?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think an answer is got lots of things going on, right? Like how did higher ed come to the point where it's at, where citizenship education becomes not really an important priority or even something that higher ed does? Lots of contributing causes. One thing that I've tried to do, Justin, has been to think about and research the history of Ohio State as just an exemplar of the evolving higher ed landscape. And so most of our listeners are probably familiar that up until the late 19th century, most American universities were focused on what we might call a liberal arts education, which prepared a person to be a great human being and in most cases, a great American citizen as well. Ohio State was actually part of a movement in the mid to late 19th century where, and this actually preceded in the common schools movement, was like another similar phenomenon where America for the first time in the mid 19th century had really robust immigration. We had people coming to the United States who didn't share the same religion as some of the Americans who had been here, didn't talk the same, didn't look the same. And Ohio was one of those places, right? Ohio was a destination for immigration in the mid to late 19th century. And so we had cities like Cincinnati where German was the language that was spoken by most people. There were a lot of folks who were Roman Catholic, which was different than the previous Protestant Christianity in America. And that caused tensions. Of course, we had the Civil War, and the Civil War, even though it ended with Appomattox, it didn't mean that people all of a sudden became healed and became kind of one political community. And so one way to think about Ohio State is that it was one of America's answers to a previous time where Americans had deep divisions, where there was a lack of commonality for a variety of reasons, some benign, some malign. And in fact, when you look at the Morrill Act, which was passed by Senator Morrill, or advocated by Senator Morrill, and then signed by President Lincoln, Ohio State is one of those land-grant universities. And people know, and rightly so, that one aspect of the mission of these land-grant universities like Ohio State is the creation and production of knowledge and then training people in that practical knowledge, which is incredibly important and valuable and has made American life. I was just traveling abroad, and one reason why I like to come back to the U.S. is we've got air conditioning. And so it was just, it's a very valuable part of American life. But at the same time, this is something I've discovered is in researching the conversations at the founding of Ohio State, was that there was actually a conversation in the Board of Trustees. It lasted a year. It was the founding year over what is our mission going to be? Is it going to be focused primarily and solely on what we might call practical education, research, and or is it going to be focused on what they would described as a liberal education at that point, what we might call a citizenship education today? And the Board of Trustees had a robust debate. Like, there was back and forth. And then on a meeting, I think it was January 1870 is my recollection. I don't have my notes in front of me. They had a vote, and they decided that they're going to do both and. We're going to do both knowledge production and transference, and we're going to form American citizens. And so that was the posture of many or most of these large public universities. University of Texas is another one. It's reflected in the mottos. It's reflected in the curricula at the time. And that I've been able to find, Justin, that in looking at the curriculum at Ohio State, it was up, and this research isn't complete by any stretch, but up until the early 1970s, a version of that commitment to a common core, we might call, of the knowledge and exposure that young people need to have to be American citizens continued. So the latest I've seen is the early 1970s, and you had to take History 101, and you had to take History 102, and you had to take biology. So there was like all the things that you would want a young person to know, they had to take. And at some point along the line, and there's lots of stories. So Ron Daniels in his book, What Universities Owe Democracy, Danielle Allen in her article that I referenced earlier, talk about the movement away from that formation of citizens. And there's a variety of reasons for that, some plausible, some less plausible. But wherever we're at a place today where even if America had the political capital and the cohesiveness, let's say in 1960, 1970, whatever the year might be, to be able to kind of maybe not form people robustly in the things that we share in common and the skills of civility. We're not at that place anymore. What I hear from folks in the General Assembly here in Ohio, and I've talked with other folks, political leaders, people who have care of the common good in other states, including Board of Trustee members, is that they have conversations with family members, with young people who have a lack of knowledge about things that they should know about America. And as a corollary, as I talked about earlier, have a hard time getting along with other people. And I'll share one anecdote that I want to attribute, where one officer who has care of the common good was having a Thanksgiving dinner, had kids and grandkids, some of the grandkids in college, and was hearing what the kids are learning in college, and it seemed not necessarily designed for a robust life of citizenship. And then that caused this person to start investigating what's going on. And so that person has become an advocate for citizenship education. So I think that's the background. There's lots of other causes as well, Justin. So why Ohio? Again, lots of causes. I think it's an alignment, really, that if you think of what it takes to set up these schools of civic thought, you need to have academics who are genuine scholars who care about the academic enterprise of truth seeking through scholarship and discipline. And there's lots of academics, of course, but the subset of academics who think that there's an opportunity for enrichment and enhancement is a much smaller percentage, and for a variety of reasons. Second, you have to have the people who care for the common good, legislators and governors. They have to observe the challenge, and they have to say, contrary to what they've been told, you have a role in enhancing your state's public education. And then they have to take the initiative to do it. And that takes courage. It takes incentives. I mean, the common good's so manifold that there are many claims on their time and on resources, and they have to say that this is something that's important. And then you have to have the faculty, right, who are going to step out into the deep and join one of these new enterprises. And with anything new, there's lots of excitement and joy and wonder, but there's also challenges and uncertainty. And so you have to have this confluence of these three things coming together at the same place and the same time. And it's been very hard. In fact, it hasn't happened before, right, up until the last 10 years or so. And so I think Ohio was a place, for whatever reason, those factors came together in a really robust way. And I think, and actually we just had all 5 civic centers came together and put together their first annual report. And I was just looking at it a little bit earlier. And so all 5 of us together have brought to Ohio over 60 scholars. We've created over 60 new courses, hosted over 50 events. We had about 1,000 students our first year. We plan to have 6,000 students next year total. So there's like a lot of now payoff is coming from the investment in Ohio in these schools of civic thought. So I genuinely think we're leading the charge when it comes to, the state is leading the charge when it comes to higher ed enhancement and enrichment.
That's excellent. That's really excellent. It's wonderful to hear.
That's fantastic. So, Lee, I think you've kind of talked about this a little bit in some of your previous answers, but I think it's fair to say that there's been some skepticism, maybe even a little bit of hostility towards the Civic Centers movement in general, and I'm sure you're cognizant of that as someone who's building up one of these new centers. Maybe some resistance within your own university, but certainly nationally as well. And I'm just wondering, what sort of strategies have you adopted to approach those kinds of concerns, and how do you address those concerns? Because it sounds like you're building something really positive, that it's young still, but it's successful and it's growing, and you've mentioned that people who experience what you're doing seem to come away with a much more positive experience or understanding, right, of the center. But maybe not everybody's going to have a chance to take a class, right, or to come to Ohio State and see what you guys are doing. So how do you deal with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one. As you referenced, Steve, earlier I had alluded to or stated that, when the Chase Center and the other four schools of civic thought were created in Ohio, it was through a process of party politics, right? And we're in a country that's had parties since around 1800, and so it's not unusual, but if it's the case that one party controls the levers of government, which in Ohio is the case, and many other states where schools of civic thought have been created, it's a reasonable inference or plausible inference to draw that these are some kind of partisan end. Now, I actually don't agree with that in principle, right? So I mentioned the orientation of Ohio State and its founding. It was started by Republicans in Congress and the president, of course, President Lincoln, and then it was started by Republicans in the State House and the governor of Ohio, who were Republicans as well. And nobody says Ohio State is some kind of partisan activity. But understanding, even if not agreeing with the point, one of the things that we've been laser focused on is maintaining a faithfulness to the mission of citizenship education for all Americans, in a way that all Americans can see as genuinely enhancing Ohio State. And it doesn't mean that people won't disagree with us on occasion, like, why'd you pick this speaker as opposed to that speaker? But we think overall, when you look at the panorama of speakers and conversations we've hosted, when you look at the overall set of courses that we're offering to students, when you look at the community and how the community operates internally and how it treats each other, that a reasonable person, a fair person, which the vast majority of faculty in OSU and elsewhere are, will see, maybe it's not something that I would necessarily have agreed with initially. I've seen that it's become a fair implementation of that citizenship mission. A part of that is invitations. And so we work really hard to invite people. When it comes to our faculty hiring, we invite people from other departments and disciplines to participate, to give feedback and thoughts on our faculty. And it's actually, in some ways, that's such a win-win. And I think one of you had mentioned earlier, I think it was you, Steve, a student who takes the course is like, wow, this actually was really great, in a way that maybe some people might have said would not be the case. And when faculty visit us for, let's say, workshops or job talks, they're like, wow, these are great people doing great academic stuff. I recognize them as academics. And so it's a win because we get the great feedback and insight for prospective faculty, but it's also a win because people are able to say, they're doing great stuff over there. So lots of invitations to people to participate in the intellectual life that we're offering. And that's paid dividends. So we have one joint appointment with another college already. I think we'll have another one sometime this academic year. We have a number of what we call faculty fellows. Those are faculty in other departments who have a formal relationship with the Chase Center. And I think that's going to grow. I'm confident that's going to grow over time as well. I would also say resources help. Right. So with resources, all things are possible. Well, maybe not all things, but many things are possible. Without them, nothing's possible. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that people who genuinely love higher education, but also want to see it enriched in the way that Chase Center can enrich it, see us as a partner for investment. And so I spend a lot of my time building those relationships, maintaining those relationships, growing those relationships, because then that allows us from a position of strength to have great faculty who can be secure, courses, student opportunities like the study abroad opportunity. And so all of these good things come from having the resources to be able to do that. So I think that's kind of the mixture, as I would see it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, going back to what you were saying earlier too, at ACTA, we just released our broadside to the nation, right? Which is, thank you. Calling on people to, enhance civic education at colleges and universities around the country. In many cases, just at it, for the first time. I think the last time we looked at it, only 19% of the over 1,000 colleges and universities we looked at require their students to take a course in American history or government in order to graduate, which just seems abysmally low. And I think especially when we're talking about public universities, and going back to what you were talking about earlier about being, created by legislative action, I think it's important for people to recognize that public universities are, in general, creations of state legislatures, and they're created for public purposes. They have an obligation to serve the public good. And it was very interesting to hear you talk about how Ohio State was created and what the original mission was. And I think it would be enlightening for people, in more cases, to go back and look at these universities and sort of see what was their original founding charter, why were they created, what were people debating at the time, and how has that played out over time, especially in light of these concerns about public trust and the question of the social compact between the institutions and that sort of thing. One other quick thing. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. And like one of the points that I've tried to raise with colleagues, and I know my other fellow directors have raised as well with their colleagues, is that even if one thinks that, let's say, the Chase Center is not needed, is not that valuable, I think instrumentally, at least one might think that, hey, I get it. Lots of Americans, lots of Ohioans are unhappy with higher ed. I don't agree with them, but I recognize it's a really important sociological phenomenon. And precisely to your point, Steve, universities are special places. They need resources, both human and otherwise, and special privileges like tenure that are really unusual in American life, and that requires public support. So even if I don't agree with the perception that some people have, I might say I want to extend an olive branch and a partnership with places like the Chase Center to show I recognize and am partnering with a positive enhancement of higher ed, as opposed to there are other, as I know you guys know, there are other proposals for reform of higher ed that are much more negative, destructive, and this is a positive way to enhance the existing system we have. And so I just wanted to affirm that point that people who have care of the common good are trying to do something really good here, and it's in some ways I think of it as like the best case scenario. It's an increased investment, it's an increased attention in a positive way to higher ed, and not alternatives which are much more dramatic, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And certainly at ACTA, we are constantly, advising people or calling on people to make salutary reforms, on their own. And, perhaps you don't like that there are external forces that also think you should do this reform. But if the reform is good for the institution and good for the country, and it addresses some of these concerns all at the same time, and, you can do that, then, by all means, I don't see why you wouldn't, support these kinds of changes and additions.
I'm actually a little bit worried, given, there has been kind of, I'm a lawyer, right? And people remember when Robert Bork was borked, we have the verb now, and there became an escalation, right, of negativity around judicial hearings. I'm a little bit worried that we're moving into a political space where there's an escalation of negativity over higher ed. It's becoming more politicized. And my hope is that these kind of what I view as very positive efforts, your efforts of suggesting let's do a civics course for all the folks in a particular state or particular university, are embraced, even if one might not necessarily agree with them, for the sake of maintaining the coalition that supports higher ed. So I think we're at kind of an inflection point that I hope goes in a really healthy direction.
Yeah, I think you're right. Justin, you want to take us home?
Yeah, Lee, thank you so much for your time. This has been a really wonderful and illuminating interview. And, I think our last question for you, you've touched on this a little bit in different ways, but maybe that you give us kind of the full vision that you have. Where do you see the Chase Center in the next 3 to 5 years? What would a success in that time frame look like to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you always, this is Aristotle and Aquinas, right? You always have to keep the end in mind, so that way you know how to get there. And I try to do that every morning, and you get kind of bogged down in details, and so you have to kind of step back. So this is a healthy opportunity for me to step back and think. So when we started off 2 years ago, my thought was that within about 5 years, it could be 1 year less, could be 1 year more, we'll reach a stage of not necessarily full maturity, but a stage of stability. So like, reaching adulthood, you're 18, 21, whatever it might be, but you're still growing. And I think, so we're like 3 years off from that. And I think there'll be opportunities in curriculum, in academic community, and then in our student program, will be, and the last one is K through 12, our outreach for that. So in terms of our curriculum, over the next 3 years, really the next year and a half to 2 years, we want to roll out 3 additional majors, which I had mentioned earlier, an honors major. So it's really high-end students who want to get the best training in oral presentation, in reading and writing of great texts. We want to have those students come and be Buckeyes. Second, a K through 12 classical and liberal arts teaching degree. So the largest sector of American education, primary and secondary, that's growing is in the classical and the adjacent spaces of liberal arts. And they have a hard time finding teachers, and they have a hard time finding school leaders. And we want to be able to produce many folks whose vocation is to participate in forming young human beings. Related is going to be the classical education school leadership degree. So we'll launch that in probably 2 years. And then lastly, but really integral to all the other 3 that I've mentioned, including our current one, which is Civics, Law, and Leadership, will be a Great Books and Ideas degree. So giving students access to the greatest texts and minds of the Western tradition. So that's going to be rolled out over the next 2.5 years, and that will get us to a place of academic maturity. We also are thinking about, and this is something that is probably 3 to 4 years out, is thinking about a PhD program. So that's something, but it's like another step beyond once we get this stuff done. Second is the academic community. So we need to grow our academic community a little bit to be able to provide all of those different classes and programs. And I would say, we're at 25 faculty. Lots of variables go into this, right? The supply of faculty, the demand for students. So another 10 faculty over the next 3 to 5 years. Resources supporting, of course. Public programming is going really well. I don't think we'll enhance that too much more. Other than what I would say is that, we're hosting, every September, we've been hosting now an annual conference on civic thought. And we want that to be the premier place where scholars writing about citizenship education, writing in the field or adjacent fields, history, present their papers, get to know each other. And so that we're going to be growing out over the next 3 years. The one that I at the student program, we're not quite to maturity yet on that one. I think we had version 1.0 this first year. It went well, and I think we'll have version 2.0 this next year, which the goal is for students to find intellectual friendships precisely because of the conversations they have, right? And so we're working on making we're setting the conditions for that to occur. And then lastly is K through 12, right? So Steve and Justin, the people who come to us with not much knowledge about America, it didn't start when they turned 18. It started, back in kindergarten. And so we want to be a partner in Ohio and around the country with K through 12 schools for their teachers and the school leaders, of course, as I said earlier, but also in terms of curriculum and continuing ed for their teachers. So this summer, we're hosting 125 teachers to help them better teach the Declaration of Independence when they go back to their schools. And that's just one aspect of the K through 12 partnership that I think will be this virtuous cycle of students will want to continue education like what they received in their classical or liberal arts school, and the Chase Center will be a great place for that. And then many of our students, because their vocation is to teach young people, will go back to those schools. So it'll be a virtuous cycle. That's the vision 3 to 5 years out. An academic community whose mission is to teach and research the great debates, texts, and ideas of the American civic tradition.
That's wonderful. Taking the totality of this interview in mind, it reminds me of something that Russell Kirk used to say, which is cheerfulness keeps breaking in. And, right, it's very easy to be discouraged in higher ed for a whole host of reasons. But hearing about what you're doing and what your faculty and your students are doing, it's hard not to walk away from the conversation feeling optimistic about the future.
That's a great point. And there's so many times, like just as you're alluding to, Justin, a person can get in the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day, and it can be mundane, which is not exciting. But boy, there are opportunities for cheerfulness that come in, and they happen all the time, right? And one of my, this is me as a dad, right? I tell my kids, have an attitude of gratitude, and I need to tell myself an attitude of gratitude as well, because this is this time period through which we're living in, this renaissance of American civic education, didn't come along before in our professional lifetimes, and so now is the time for it to happen. So I'm speaking to myself, let's be thankful for the opportunity to be around when it's going on.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Lee. It sounds like you guys are doing really great work out there and seeing success. And of course, at ACTA, we totally support it, and we're so glad to see it. Thanks for being on the podcast today. Thanks for all the work that you're doing, and we look forward to seeing what happens in the future for you and the Chase Center.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation, and ACTA, you guys do so much good work for us, and we really appreciate the partnership.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lee.
Well, that was a really great conversation. Lots of interesting things from Lee. Justin, what were your takeaways?
Well, I as I said during the interview, I just think that's a story that not enough people are hearing about what these centers are actually doing. It's so easy, and many people do this in a variety of different ways, to just get lost in like color coding, if blue state, red state, that kind of thing, and then that just determines how they think about these centers. I just find it hard to believe. You'd have to be like a really hardened ideologue to listen to how Lee's describing this and come away with, this is like a Republican hatchet job kind of, that's so preposterous to me. So I thought this was really positive, because there are people out there who want these to fail, and we might talk about that in a minute. And even if you have support, these things are not prefabricated, and Lee just kind of stepped in to start running things. The state authorizes them and creates some kind of framework, parameters, mission, and that's great. But you've got to build it all. An architect can give you the blueprints, but if you don't know how to put the house together, it's not going to work. And he's just done a marvelous job of putting something together that seems to be resonating with so many students, and seems to even be winning over skeptics on campus, which is not, an easy thing to do. So I really appreciated that part of it. And I also thought he was right. And this is not a surprise given where we work, because we also believe this. That this kind of education is so desperately needed. When I started my academic job before I came to ACTA, we did not have a course in the political science program on American government. And I asked, why aren't we doing this? And the answer was, well, everybody knows all that stuff already. And after spending a year in the classroom, I said, look, here's the evidence. Nobody knows anything about this. We need to do this class. And my colleagues were very supportive. And we started an intro to American government kind of course. And it was desperately needed. And, probably a lot more programming than that to really catch people up just on basic facts. It's, I think for too many students, and frankly, for too many adults, the idea of knowing about American politics is largely just staying up with current events. Mm-hmm. And that's not wrong, but it's not right enough. There's so many other things you need to know to really understand the American political tradition, and very little of it comes through the television or YouTube. So I just thought he did a really good job of explaining the good work that the Chase Center is doing, and why that kind of work is desperately needed now. So, Steve, what did you think?
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And as you know, we do surveys of students at ACTA. We have another one that's coming out, or may even be out by the time this is published, asking students basic questions about American government, asking them basic questions about American history, like key moments in American history, key documents, that sort of thing. I'm always blown away by even things like college graduates or college students who don't know how long a term is for a senator or a member of the House of Representatives, like just really basic stuff like that. Not to mention, not being able to identify a quote from the Gettysburg Address or that sort of thing. And so we really do, as a nation, need to shore this up and be giving people a better education. And of course, as I mentioned during the interview, ACT has just come out with our broadside to the nation, and calling on colleges and universities to implement a requirement that every graduate take a course in American history or government, and one that focuses on some of the key documents in American history. I mean, everyone should want this for the students going through our system of higher education. And of course, we don't mind if trustees signal that the university is going to implement this requirement, and we don't mind if legislatures do it for public universities. This is an important way that they should be serving the people of their states and serving the nation more generally. So, I think it was really interesting to hear him address some of that and how they're doing that. Another thing, people, say if I'm talking about the broad side or the lack of civic education more generally, people will sometimes point out, well, shouldn't they have already learned this in K-12? And part of my answer is yes, and they're not. And Lee did, I think, touch on that even a bit in the interview. But there's also room to continue this kind of education, obviously, when you get to the level of higher education. I mean, ideally, you would have a foundation in terms of your knowledge of American history and American government by the time you graduated high school. But then when you go to college, there's still plenty of room to keep learning, to keep developing habits of citizenship, to go deeper into the materials, all those sorts of things. And I don't know why we wouldn't want people, in our country who have gone through this process. And then one last thing that I think that he brought up that I think is really important too is this kind of feedback loop back into teaching in K-12 that the Chase Center and a lot of these other centers are engaged in, that they have these public missions that extend beyond campus. And that can involve like public events, but it also includes all kinds of opportunities for teacher training and that sort of thing. And so, it's sort of a generational project, but over time, you will have people who are better informed, becoming better teachers, going back and teaching students who will in turn come up better prepared, and we can start to elevate the standard of the discourse and the quality of the education over time, both in the K-12 system and in higher education.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of it. It's very difficult. I had a friend who did this successfully, but it's not easy to get like federal grants to try and do some of that restoration of the American political tradition in K through 12 curriculum. And, you don't need a one size fits all. It's only going to come from this kind of granting agency or that kind of thing. Multiple scaled groups can and should be doing this kind of work because there is a sense in which, you shouldn't have to teach kind of, and I'm not saying this is what the Chase Center is doing, but, kind of remedial American history in college. But that is the situation we're in.
Right.
So you've got to start from where you are and work to getting into a better place. And Chase is certainly helping with that. It's really marvelous. Now, a few minutes ago, I said you'd have to be a really hardened ideologue not to appreciate all of that. So, unfortunately, there are more than a few of those folks in higher education. So something I wanted to talk with you about briefly is John Saylor, a friend of the show, I think our inaugural guest on RFC.
That's right.
Wrote a piece in City Journal about, and I know our listeners will be shocked, the clandestine efforts of the American Association of University Professors to take down and besmirch the reputations of centers like the one we've just been hearing about. So tell our audience a little bit about kind of what John's reporting, what the issue is here, and we can go from there.
Yeah, well, it really is some incredible reporting by John and City Journal over there at the Manhattan Institute. But basically, I believe through a public records request, he got access to some recordings and transcripts and documents of this relatively new Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom that the AAUP's created. I'm not sure if I quite named it right, but I think it is the CDAF.
Yeah, you got it right.
Okay, thanks. And, basically some of their internal conversations talking about what they're up to. And one of the things that they seem most interested in is coming after these civic centers and anybody who supports them. They seem to see them clearly as a threat to academic the university, the academic world, maybe academic freedom as well. To me, this is part and parcel of a trajectory that the AAUP has been on, especially under its current leadership for the last couple of years. If you were to give it sort of an interpretation from their point of view, I suppose they would say that, they're articulating a certain vision of academic freedom that emphasizes things like process and democracy and isn't so focused on outcomes. We've seen this before. Actually, it's mentioned during the course of some of these meetings. The case of Amy Wax comes up at one point, and both in their official reactions to that and in this conversation, their take seems to be that, a process involving faculty took place or was followed, and so they're fine with the outcome, basically. And so they seem to have really increasingly moved away from seeing the importance of academic freedom as a mechanism that defends individual faculty members and minority viewpoints on campuses, focusing much more on sort of the will of the faculty as a collective, right? Focusing more on this idea of faculty collective independence or autonomy, and that they sort of make the decisions, and that's the point of academic freedom, right? And so that then makes you wonder, well, what happens to the people within the faculty who disagree or stray from the accepted lines and that sort of thing? But they've also just taken a series of decisions or actions that sort of consistently side with a sort of left-leaning view of things, if you will, or create openings for people on the left to sort of advance their politics. And so, I think it's difficult to look at it and not see a partisan slide here on their part. And when you go through this article and listen to some of the recordings and that sort of thing, it's hard not to conclude, honestly, that to some degree, this sounds like it's almost more about power and control, that the faculty want to have, in their view, right, the faculty who are associated with the AAUP want to have a kind of complete power and control over the universities. They talk about shared governance, but they have a very inflated view of what the faculty's role ought to be within that structure, to the point where it strains the word shared, I would say.
Yeah. No, for our audience, just in case, anyone wants to, consider, our Justin and Steve overstating the case here. So these are some quotes coming out of John Saylor's piece from Isaac Kamola, the director of the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. So this is that director saying, quote, "I would really love to see kind of a robust research project on these right-wing centers and individuals, like naming and shaming and discrediting and undermining the legitimacy. I would love to strategically map who these effers," that's, me being polite and not using the F word. So much for academic professionalism.
I don't know how we keep bumping up against the issue of whether we can use the F word on this show, but it keeps happening.
I just don't want our brilliant message to get, stymied by YouTube's ridiculous algorithm. Just kidding. Praise.
We also
Kier.
have standards at ACTA.
Yeah.
We have standards of professionalism at ACTA.
I mean, it's apples and oranges, because we're a professional organization in that sense. I just couldn't imagine any of our bosses saying this about the other side. I want to strategically map these effers and figure out what their weaknesses are. I mean, this is such sloppy middle school level Machiavellianism. It really does seem like academic freedom is just a much better sounding phrase for, we want total control. I think about this along similar lines to the way that, branding is important, right? You can't call yourself the genocidal, homicidal state of Korea. That sounds terrible, because you'd be telling people what you do. But if you call yourself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, I mean, that sounds amazing. It's got democracy, people, republic, all of that good stuff. And it's in Korea. That's great. That name doesn't really tell you much about what the regime's actually doing. And when I think about the way in which academic freedom is being, like that term's being abused, in this context. It's really frustrating because, when you look at the origins of the AAUP, going back to things like the 1915 statement, and even things, at the turn of the 20th century, it's a completely different organization now. It is no different from any number of other left-leaning, like public sector unions. Mm-hmm. Like, they're not interested in academic freedom. They're interested in power, and they call it something that is meant to, directly or indirectly put people off the scent, so to speak. But I find this like disgraceful. It's just totally unprofessional conduct from someone who thinks of themselves as an academic.
Yeah, there probably is an interesting story to be told about the AAUP's adoption of, transition to also being a labor union, going back to the 60s and 70s. But the turn in the last couple of years has been especially notable. And yeah, I mean, it is, definitely unfortunate to see them, going after these centers. And you can even see in the quotes that you read that they're characterizing these centers in the worst possible way. And, we saw in our conversation with Lee that this is not an accurate description, certainly of what's going on at the Chase Center. At all. And for them to sort of set themselves up as an organization representing academic freedom in general and the faculty in general, but then to be sort of taking sides in fights like this, I think is problematic to say the least, and revealing of what they're really up to. So, I'll say too that in some cases, perhaps some of the lawsuits that they've filed in the last year or so, maybe some of them are correct, or they were right to do it, but overall, their strategy seems to be one of sort of hardcore resistance to change and an unwillingness to acknowledge that some of the ideas that other organizations are floating and other groups within higher ed as well might be helpful. So they've changed their position on academic boycotts. They consistently, as we've discussed on this show, do not seem to be fans of viewpoint diversity, or at least the need for the argument that there's a need for more viewpoint or intellectual diversity. They have said that DEI statements can be consistent, with academic freedom when it comes to hiring and promotion. They haven't decisively, they address institutional neutrality. They don't really seem to support it. I think they said, it could be consistent with academic freedom. But so all these other things that a lot of other people are seeing as positive developments, and that more and more universities are starting to change on, they're still kind of not endorsing these changes. And, at the very end, Lee was talking about basically, an argument from prudence, right? That we're in a state where a lot of people are turning on higher education. And certainly you see that when you engage in these debates online. And we see that in some of the polling from Pew or from Gallup when it comes to public trust and that sort of thing. I think it's critical that those within higher ed realize that they do have a problem here and that there are things that they could do to address it. I mean, a great example that we discussed recently was this report that came out of Yale University, where they acknowledged the declining public trust and they acknowledged that they had some role in it. And they came up with a whole list of recommendations for reform that they think could help. And a lot of these reforms are things that lots of people will like, including faculty in higher ed. So, I think there's a need for a much more sort of positive and responsive approach to higher ed reform. And yes, sometimes there will be instances where you just have to, put your feet in the sand and say, no, like we cannot allow this or we cannot agree with that. But there's plenty of things that can be done that faculty would benefit from. And the AAUP seems consistently to be unwilling to, go along with just about anything that would be a positive reform for higher ed.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The right-wingers are out to get us. Well, like ridiculous intransigence in the face of an actual emergency means people of all sorts of political and other affiliations might end up trying to solve the problem that, on one level, you should be ideally situated to fix. Yeah. But keep doing what you're doing, AAUP, because every day you just make yourself more and more irrelevant. And that's great for me because then that keeps me employed. So a shameless bit of self-promotion. By the way, if anyone watching this decides to apply to the Chase Center, you need to plug us in your cover letter to Professor Strang, because we want to measure our impact in various ways on this show.
Heard about this opportunity through Radio Free Campus.
The greatest higher ed podcast in the United States.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, we better wrap things up here. I guess we'll have another episode after this one in a couple of weeks talking about some of the latest news. You'd think that there wouldn't be much news maybe in higher ed over the summer, but it never ceases to surprise me that there's plenty to talk about.
I think July and August are the time for trying to sneak policies in when you think people aren't looking. So yeah, we'll definitely get to the latest on that. So thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, share with your friends, and until next time, KBO.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free Campus. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Audio-only versions of Radio Free Campus are available on all other podcast streaming platforms. Whether you have comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, the hosts would love to hear from you. Comment below or email them at radiofreecampus@goacta.org. Radio Free Campus is offered by the Campus Freedom Initiative at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. For more information, please visit goacta.org. Only 19% of all Virginia students surveyed say their campus is very welcoming of people with unpopular political opinions. Discover more at goacta.org.